Hi, welcome to episode 3 of JavaScript for Intermediate Programmers, where today we're going to go over a simple app for hitting a public API and displaying data from that service in a little web app. The API we're going to look at today is the so-called Poke API, which is available on the web at pokeapi.co. You might know, you might not know that an API is a service placed on the web with information that you can hit programmatically. So you make what's called a request to a particular URL and some data comes back. In the case of the Poke API, the URL where the information is at is pokeapi.co/API-v2. You can follow this by Pokemon in the name of a Pokemon character to get back a large number of information surrounding that particular Pokemon character, like its abilities, its forms, game indices, held items, moves, and something called sprites. Sprites is the part we're going to be interested in for our little app because we can grab a little piece of data in here, like this thing called front default, to get an image of the character. So let's take a look at how all that can be done in JavaScript. Okay, so let's begin with going to the P5 editor that we've been using in previous episodes. And just as before, we'll remove the existing starter code, none of which we're going to need, and go straight to the HTML and clean this thing up just a little bit. Let's put our meta element before the head element, and here we are, good to go. Okay, so let's begin by displaying a button for us to click in order to get information about a particular character. First thing I'd like to do is go to the style sheet and give a background color of, make things a little bit more visible, background color, light gray to start. And let's run the program. There we go. So we'll be able to see things a little bit better now. Let's begin with a button. And on our button, we'll write well, everyone knows Pikachu. I think that's the most popular of the Pokemon characters. So now I have a little button. Easy to do. And now we want to write an event listener, which we covered in the previous video, so that when this button is hit, something happens. So let's go into our sketch and we'll first make our button, we'll make it a const, and we'll make it be what? Document.query selector. It's the one and only button, all right? And you might recall the process. We add an event listener. So when this button is clicked, we will cause an event to take place. An action should take place. The click takes place when you click it. But what do we want to do in response to that click? We would like to show the Pokemon, I guess, right? So let's make a function, show Pokemon, and well, I think right now what we'll do is before we hit the API, let's learn a new piece of JavaScript, console.log, which is going to write down here to this little thing called the console. This is what we call the document. The document is the thing that the browser shows where you draw things in. The console is where you write little bits of informative messages. So I'm just going to write the word hello. So we grab our button, and when the button is clicked, we call this show Pokemon function, which does console.log hello. Let's test it. Click on Pikachu, and the word hello shows up. Okay, that's great and everything, but now how do we, rather than just displaying a message to the console, how do we actually hit that API, grab the data, parse it, and display something in our browser window, in the browser rather than the console? All right, so let's work on that. What we need to do is we're going to learn about a function called fetch. Fetch is a JavaScript function built into the browser that when you give it an API, in this case, you might recall that it was HTTP. Well, you know what? Let's make it easy. Let's just copy it and put it in here / Pokemon Pikachu. All right. So fetch is going to grab that data, and it's going to come back with an actual response. It's not going to come back with that data that I showed you here. It's going to come back with a actual response. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, some of you may be familiar with the way that your web browser has on it some tools that show you how your browser is communicating with the rest of the world. If we go to the network tab, if I were to hit this button right here, you can see, all right, so we clicked on, sorry, we hit a URI called Pikachu. And what came back was all this information right here, same information you're seeing in the browser window. But more interestingly, we saw that we came back with the status code and request method, refer policy, and all this information. That's because the way the web works is browsers make requests to servers which send back responses. Responses have a response code in there, which in the case of 304 is a particular code that means, hey, you asked this about me earlier, you already have that information. So, hey, browser, you have it. Don't worry about it. If there's a different Pokemon, like, is there one called Charmander? Let's hit Charmander and see if I asked for that. Oh, I had not asked for that one before. So I got back at 200. 200 is the browser's way of saying, okay. But the point is, for JavaScript, that fetch actually gives you back something called a response. And you can look at the browser's response status code. In fact, we can, if we wanted to, we can console.log this response. I believe it's called, is it called status code? It's called, oh, it's just called status. Sorry about that. Let's go back to our code here and say, response.status like I have here. And this is not going to work, okay? Because when I click this thing here, I'm going to get back something called undefined. And this is a huge big deal about JavaScript. It's what makes JavaScript so incredibly powerful. And it's something that makes JavaScript a little hard for beginners to wrap their heads around, at least at first. And what's happening is the following. When you call fetch, you're not really getting back a response. I kind of simplified things a little bit. When you call fetch, what you get back is actually something called a promise. And it works like this. You say, fetch some data from this URL. They both work. And JavaScript says, okay, I will do that. But what I have for you is a promise that later on, I will have filled this information in later. But I'm just going to run fetch really quick and say, okay, I'm going to do it. Here's a promise. I will fill this in for you later. And it immediately proceeds, right after saying that it's going to fetch for you. It will log out the response status, which is, well, undefined because fetch doesn't really return anything. The thing is that fetch happens later. You know, the actual data that comes in for the fetch happens later. So we could write, in this case, if I wanted to, I could put the promise in a variable, and I could, after this promise is ready, I could do what's called resolving it. So strictly speaking, we can say when the promise is resolved, then carry out a function to show me what this status is. And response is not defined because I called it, because the promise passes this information in here as a response, and we get a 200 back. Okay, now this is not really the best kind of code. It's not a very modern way to write code like this, because JavaScript nowadays is going to make things a lot nicer for you. Even though fetch doesn't happen right away and takes some time before it works, we can't just get the result of the response to fetch by doing something like this, unless we do two nice little things. One is we make the function async, and then we put the word await before the fetch. So two things are happening here. One is we're saying, hey, this function is asynchronous. It has some long-running code in it. It has some asynchronous code. It has some things that we're going to be awaiting. Like when you fetch, the data doesn't come back right away, but we can say with await, we know it's not going to come back right away, but we'll actually get all the code after the await to take place whenever everything is done. So we'll put our response here, and then we'll log the response status, and you can see that this does work, and we get a 200 again. By the way, the reason we're getting 304s in the browser is that, well, your browser is really good about telling the server the last time it made a call, whereas our JavaScript code is not doing that. But that's more advanced stuff, so worry not, okay? Anyway, we have a response and we can get the status. But what about all this data with the abilities and all that other stuff? This data is in a format called JSON, spelled JSON. So after we get our response, yes, we can get a response status, but what's more interesting is we can get the actual data, we'll call it the actual Pokemon, is going to come from the responses JSON. And guess what? It takes time to parse that JSON. So this is something else that JavaScript makes us await. Now that we do this, we can say console.log this Pokemon data if we wanted to here. And it's going to come back as 200. Response is not defined because, yes, I know spelling is hard. Let's click the button again. And here we get back our object. It's got the abilities, the forms, the game indices. We have all our data here. So perhaps what we might want to get is our sprites. Let's see what we get for our Pokemon sprites. Yeah, there they all are right over here. Let's grab the front default. Front default. Let's try this. Great. We have an actual URL. So now the next thing we want to do is let's get all this data, but rather than just logging it to the console, let's try to embed this in our HTML right underneath the button. So let's go here, and underneath the button, let's put in an IMG element. You might remember, or maybe you've never seen this before, but that's okay. The IMG element has an src, which is the URL of the image that we want to fetch, and it has some other attributes too. One of the most important ones is ALT. This is what you're supposed to, this is some text that you want to show for the image for people that maybe they have their images turned off, or maybe they're blind and they need a screen reader to read for them. So we can say picture of Pikachu here. And then if we have this source element right here, we need the URL of the Pokemon. See, right now it's coming out as a broken image. Okay, it's coming out as a broken image because, well, we want to get this data from the server. We don't want to get it. We don't know it right here when we're writing out the HTML. This is not known at all. So perhaps what we should do is let's put in an ID for the picture. We don't have an src right now. There's nothing. We're going to fill this in later, but we do have an image whose ID is picture. And you might remember from the last video that when you have an ID attribute on a particular element, it's now available to the JavaScript by saying document query selector, and this is the element whose ID is, was it picture? Yes, we made it picture. That's good. So now, rather than just console logging it, what we could do, this is kind of cool, we can say picture with the SRC is this information, okay? And when we have that, if we click on the button, it fetches from the API the picture and it plops it in place right there. And there you go. We've just fetched some data from an API. And is there anything else we should talk about? Well, perhaps there's a couple other things that are fun to do. Pokemon with an unknown name is some kind of an error there, right? Look at this, 404. Maybe you remember that 404 is not found. So perhaps if we get a 404, we might wish to say that Pokemon does not exist. And it's possible to do that, right? We could put out some text right here, maybe a paragraph element whose ID is error. Okay, let's close our element here. Interesting thing about HTML, IMG is an element that's not supposed to have a closing tag, but P is supposed to have a closing tag, you know, go figure, that's just the way it is. So let's try and deal with that. So we can say that if our status, if the response.status is in the 200 or 300 range, so let's say greater than or equal to 200 and status, we'll say less than or equal to, or say, we'll just say less than 400. Then we know that it's good. And we can get our response. We can set the picture and we can set the, well, let's make our error element. Error. And we'll have our error element text content be blank, right? Otherwise, okay, we will empty out the SRC and we'll set this to, let's learn something new about JavaScript right now. Problem, server said, and then we'll put in the response status here. This is fun. In JavaScript, if your strings are delimited by backticks, then you can put in here an expression between $ left brace and a right brace, an expression to be what they call interpolated. So whatever the status is, we'll drop it in here. So if I click this, it said problem, server said 404. Okay, that's because we, have a bad Pokemon name here. The next step is probably to let us select the name of a Pokemon from a list, click on that, and then show that Pokemon's picture. So a little bit to do right here. Let's go in here, and rather than having a button for Pikachu, let's put in a list with UL, which stands for unordered list, a bunch of items with Pikachu and Ditto. I only know about Ditto. I don't really know anything about Pokemon. I just saw this on the API. There's Pokemon, there's Ditto, there's, oh, Eevee is actually a kind of a famous one. And one more, Rattata. All right. So here's a code here. What we want to do is now if we click on one of these things, we want to have the Pokemon show up right here in the picture element. So that means that in our JavaScript, we no longer have a button element, right? Well, we do have those. We do have a list. We do have list elements, right? But we can get these, we're going to get these a different way. Okay, this is actually going to be interesting. What we're going to do here is where we add the event listener to a button, we're going to be pretty cool here. We're going to say we want to get each one of these list items. So remember for let item of, and now here we're going to do this. This is cool. Document query selector all. We want to get all of the elements that are LI elements. Everything that's an LI. LI stands for list item. And for each one of those items, we're going to add an event listener to show the Pokemon. And what Pokemon? Pikachu? Well, let's see if that works. If I click on Eevee, it shows Pikachu. If I click on Ditto, it shows Pikachu. What we want to do right here is actually find out, hey, what did you actually click on? Like if I click on Ditto, I want the word Ditto to show up. If I want to click on Eevee, I want Eevee to show up. So I have to find a way to get the text that I clicked on into the show Pokemon function so that I can render its name here. Okay, how is that done? All right, well, if you remember from last video, JavaScript programs that run in the browser are supposed to react to things that happen. Mouse got clicked, mouse moved, mouse entered an area of the screen, the document got loaded, the document's going to be, we're going to leave this page, we move the accelerometer, it's just, you know, I typed into an input box. The input, the event that we're trying to react to here is the click, right? Now, when an event happens, no matter what it is, what happens is you get an event object sent to your listener function. So we're saying when a click happens, call show Pokemon. Who's calling show Pokemon? We're not calling show Pokemon. The JavaScript browser engine is calling show Pokemon, and it will send us an event. And that event will have on it a target. Okay, and it's called, I think it's just called target. Let's see. Trying to find out name. I'm just checking what I have over here. Yeah, target. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the name of the Pokemon, and it's going to be e.target and then the actual text content of the element. Remember, there's an LI element whose text content is Pikachu or Ditto or whatever. So we're going to get its text content, and we're going to convert that to lowercase. And that's going to be the name. Then we're going to embed the name into our string. But if you want to embed some data into a string, you have got to use the back quotes. All right. Now, if we click on Ditto, we get Ditto, Rattata, Eevee, and Pikachu, and things look okay. Let's try. I'm not done yet. I'm not done. Don't turn off the video right now because we haven't talked about security yet. Let's do a little keyboard mash first, just to make sure that things look okay, and we get our Rattata, and there's our 404. So that's good. Okay, a little bit about security over here. Every time you manufacture a URL out of text, and that text can come from the user, so anybody can inject text in here, you better believe that people are going to try and put in some nasty stuff in that URL. Somehow or other, they're going to find a way to call your website with some nasty stuff. So we need to make sure that this name does not have any characters like slashes or ampersands or anything else that the URL can interpret in ways that say that might be a fragment or a query or might redirect to some other site. I mean, all sorts of bad things can happen. I mean, not too much here, but in general, horrible things can always happen. So it's very, very important that every time you're about to shove stuff into a URL, you need to write encode URI component. You need to wrap that text with it. Now, nothing's going to change here. I mean, I'm still going to get did. I'm still going to get Eevee, Rattata, Pikachu, and get my error over here. All that's going to, it's just like before, except we're not going to send in a malformed URL to the server, which could in principle cause trouble. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Notice one thing I did not do is I did not put in a pretty style sheet. So you're encouraged, if you want to play with this code, to probably make a 2-column document where you have like a little menu on the left, and then you put your pictures and stuff on the right. It's a fun thing to try. You can use the little display colon grid that we used in episode number 2. So hope that was useful to you. We're going to move to the command line for episode 4 if you choose to continue with the series. All right, so ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.